All right, let's go ahead and get started. I hope that everybody's doing well today. I'm going to be also playing tech support while I wait for my classmate to join me and help out in a couple of minutes. So I'll be intermittently admitting people to the meeting, but just wanted to give an overview of myself. My name is Katie Tyndall, and I'm a graduate student at Cornell University in the School of Architecture, Art, and Planning, studying urban and regional planning. I am the research assistant to Professor Linda Shy, who is the chair of the Association for Collegiate Schools of Planning Climate Action Task Force, and had the brilliant idea, along with some of the other Climate Action Task Force members, uh, to start this climate careers panel series to show planning students, current graduate students, undergraduate students, and those who are interested in a career in planning, or a career in climate change, how planning can prepare them for that career. So we have three wonderful panelists. I think Christian just joined us as well. I'm going to add a pin for him. And yeah, so today's topic is climate change and housing. And we have three wonderful panelists who are all either urban planning graduate school graduates or currently enrolled in urban planning school and work for a variety of organizations, municipalities across the United States. I'm going to let them give an overview of their name, where they currently practice and / their current employer, whether it's a government, nonprofit, or otherwise, and where they received their planning degree to get started.
I can start.
Or sorry, Kai.
Sure. Yeah, Kai Lord Farmer. I work for the Ulster County Planning Department. Ulster County is 90 miles north of New York City in the Hudson Valley area. Yeah, senior planner, planning department, working on housing and some climate as well. I received my master's degree from California Polytechnic Institute, Cal Poly, in San Luis Obispo.
Thanks. I can follow. It's nice to meet everybody. My name's Annie Carforo. I currently work at We Act for Environmental Justice as their climate justice campaign manager. I come from a background of grassroots policy advocacy and organizing. I formerly worked, I started my career in housing. So I was working with an organization called Neighbors Together, advocating for solutions to homelessness, organizing with people who are experiencing homelessness, and thinking about creative ways that we can expand social housing and fair housing across New York City and state. And now at We Act, I'm doing, bringing some of that housing knowledge into our work around climate resilience, adaptation, and a just transition away from fossil fuels. And I am one of those panelists that is currently working on their degree in urban planning. I'm in my last semester at Hunter College for their Master's of Planning.
Great, thanks, Annie. Christian.
Hi, good afternoon or good morning, everybody. I'm Christian Kamrath. I'm with Miami-Dade County's Office of Resilience, and I'm our program manager for our sea level rise adaptation team within our office. My background originally stems from meteorology and thinking about natural hazards, but I went to get a master's in city and regional planning from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where there was a real emphasis and focus on natural hazard resilience and connecting like long-term disaster recovery with climate adaptation work. So yeah, super excited to be here, and thanks for the opportunity.
Great, thank you all for those great introductions. I'm gonna a couple more people. Okay, so we can kind of go in order, or if you guys want to like popcorn to an individual person, just feel free to chime in whenever a question kind of piques your interest and you want to talk about it first, and then We'll kind of go through these series of 4 or 5 questions, and then I'll have some time for Q&A at the end. Um, and yeah, first question is, how does your organization slash agency currently address climate issues impacting your area's housing stock and or population growth or decline?
I can jump in first, just because WeAct has done a lot on the issue of climate issues and housing. A lot of environmental justice issues when it came to housing formerly have really focused on addressing environmental hazards inside people's homes. So, people are surprised to hear this because we've known for thousands of years or hundreds of years that lead is a toxic substance that should not be around people. But in New York has one of the highest lead poisoning rates in the country, and it disproportionately impacts communities that are Black and brown that are living in lower income housing. And so WeAct for a very long time, and to this day continues to fight to end lead childhood lead poisoning and getting lead fully out of people's homes. That seems to be a kind of forgotten issue that really does impact specific communities in a really, really negative way. But we've also done lots of advocacy around making sure that people's homes are safe and healthy to live in, that they're free of mold, they're free of asbestos, that they're weatherized, that they're able to retain heat in the winter and cooling in the summer. And a lot of our work has started to evolve as we've seen that the housing stock in New York City in particular is really not keeping up with the impacts of climate change. As well as on top of a climate crisis, we're also seeing a corresponding housing crisis in New York City where rents are skyrocketing. It doesn't seem like the bubble will ever pop. And, we just had a recent vacancy survey in New York City found that the vacancy rate in the city is only at 1.4%, which means that if you're looking for an apartment, particularly if you're low income, that it's pretty much impossible to do. And so we are addressing it now in an evolving way. We're also thinking about how is climate impacting New Yorkers, particularly environmental justice communities more. We're seeing more flooding. We're seeing more extreme heat, much hotter and longer heat waves. And these all have equity issues, baked in. When we think about, I think a really clear example of this like overlap between climate and housing was Hurricane Ida back in 2021, where 13 New Yorkers lost their lives. 11 of those lived in basement apartments, which are unregulated, naturally occurring affordable housing. Most people who live in basement apartments don't want to live in a basement apartment, but they do so because that's what they can afford. And it puts them at risk now when we are seeing areas that are flooding more frequently and also seeing more deadly floods happening. But there are limited options of where to go or where to find housing that is considered safe. And so WeAct has been, really thinking in about how do we expand the stock of social housing, of publicly owned housing, of decommodified housing in our neighborhoods so that people have affordable housing in perpetuity. And so we've been doing more work around, New York Social Housing Development Authority, around expanding community land trusts in our neighborhood. And also thinking about how we're protecting people from extreme weather events. So, a big thing that we're thinking about is heat, right? In New York, there are laws that landlords have to provide heating to your apartment in the wintertime. But there's no laws that say they have to provide cooling in the summertime. And heat is more deadly than flooding, and every other natural disaster combined. And so we've been thinking about ways to regulate, requirements to have cooling in people's homes. How do we provide clean cooling for people instead of, big, dirty window units? And so I listed a bunch of things there, but I think there's really such a clear overlap between housing justice and climate justice. And our organization has, constantly been evolving to address like these ongoing crises that seem to be getting worse.
Great, thanks. Kai, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah, so I guess Well, we recently had a county executive who passed a resolution to reduce carbon emissions in line with the state's climate goals, which was the first county in the state to do that. So that's kind of leading the way in terms of addressing the climate front. My work previously was in climate action planning and adaptation planning in California. So I'm trying to bring that work to the county, which is in recent years thinking more about the nexus between housing and climate change. Um, I think this all got kind of sparked. Wow, the climate crisis in Ulster County had been there for a while, but during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2021, Ulster County had the highest year-over-year housing price increase in the country. And so we had a lot of folks with a certain amount of privilege moving out of New York City and relocating in the Hudson Valley in Ulster County. And so kind of spiked and is going down a little bit, but is still very, very high and isn't coming down from pre-pandemic levels. So that issue is obviously related to climate in terms of its impact on the housing stock. But there are other events like Ida, like Irene. We see these surges of new residents coming in and relocating from coastal areas. So that's kind of the impetus. But in terms of what we're doing, we recently adopted our government operations climate action plan. We're about to kick off our community climate action plan. The county executive just approved a decarbonization capital reserve to decarbonize all the county facilities. We're working on an emergency operations center, which with a climate focus in mind. So when disasters do occur, there's better communication and coordination across the county for emergency response. And then in my realm, which is mostly housing, we're working on an ADU grant program to provide affordable accessory dwelling units for folks that are going to be all electric. We're doing a green retrofits program for decarbonizing buildings. Affordable rental upgrades. So that's kind of at the nexus of keeping rental housing that is affordable but needs upgrades, keeping it affordable in exchange for grants for energy efficiency or weatherization or health and safety improvements. And I could go on and on, but we also do a flood buyout program in partnership with New York City. We have one of New York City's reservoirs for drinking water, and as a way to prevent water contamination and water quality, we do a buyout of homes that are in the floodplain and in the Ashokan Reservoir watershed. So there's some climate housing nexus there. And then the last, we're about to kick off next month, a housing trust fund that prioritizes green development, but also making sure that it's resilient and also decommodified in the sense that we're prioritizing perpetually affordable housing or housing that gets put into a community land trust or another mechanism to get it out of the speculative market.
Thank you so much, Guy.
Mm-hmm.
Chris.
Tough acts to follow. They guys are doing so much great work out there, and I hear a lot of the same types of programs that Miami-Dade County is also either setting up or scaling up. We're as with a lot of places, sort of have our own affordable housing crisis, separate and probably but exacerbated by the climate crisis. We're one of the most unaffordable areas when you look at the wages that are made here in Miami-Dade County. So there's a lot of stress being felt, right, by the community. A lot of our work, as a county, we have a lot of plans and a lot of kind of focused resiliency strategies that come out of our Office of Resilience, and those are always created with multiple departments, with the community, and a lot of community based organizations input. So even though my work focuses on sea level rise and our sea level rise strategy outlines a lot of that work, there's also an extreme heat action plan that was developed with our chief heat officer in Miami-Dade County. And so that's part of the two sort of lanes that definitely overlap and provide the framework for the issues that we address with housing and climate. I'd say one thing that we're working towards, and my predecessor who's on the call helped write a grant to hire staff within our public housing department, both a resilience program manager, an architect, and an engineer, to conduct both climate risk assessments and energy audits of about 20 of our county-owned affordable housing multifamily buildings. And there's for better or for worse, there's sort of a pipeline of planning and assessment and then design and implementation for retrofitting these older buildings to make them more climate resilient, affordable, efficient, etc. So it was a Department of Housing and Urban Development federal grant that's funding that work. But it's a struggle to work those grant agreements, and there's a lot to get going there. So it hasn't kicked off yet, but we're in the hiring process for those positions to have internal capacity to conduct those assessments for not only the housing buildings, but other critical facilities. And that will inform the development of actual design guidelines for retrofit and future public housing development. So there's a lot of great work going on in the various universities and community-based organizations that are also putting out helpful resources. There's a program called Keep Safe Florida with Enterprise Community Partners that is also providing resources and the best practices for looking at that. And then I'd say, the other thing that we look at too is just from the heat side, I can kind of, there was a recent report of the progress being made in our extreme heat action plan. So part of what that looks like once it's implemented is our mayor and our commission approving not a huge amount, but 1.3 million to install 1,700 efficient AC units in public housing where there is inadequate cooling, and then a boost to our weatherization assistance program. So an additional $3 million to help deal with that. It's a drop in the bucket, honestly, to the actual need. It's a chronically underfunded program, but trying to take advantage of any and all funding opportunities for that. Yeah, I'll just stop there. But we have tried, but been challenged to set up things like voluntary home buyout programs for flooding. But it's certainly a major topic of concern and conversation, how we deal with those repetitive flood losses or just other chronically stressed areas that experience flooding. So thanks.
Great, thank you, Christian. Thank you guys. All really compelling, fascinating responses your organizations and agencies are undertaking. So I'm going to skip the second question because it seemed like that was kind of addressed in this first one. So how did planning school prepare you guys for this line of work, or not, like at the time you graduated from planning school, or if you're currently enrolled, or is there extensive coursework on kind of some of these climate programs? Were there any kind of soft skills or hard skills that you learned that you still utilize on a daily basis in planning school? And did your kind of professors or mentor relationships result from planning school? If whoever wants to take that first, or I can probably call.
I can jump in and go first.
Awesome.
And
Thanks.
yeah, I would just say, what led me to planning school was kind of wanting to work at the local government level, where it seemed like a lot of the, decisions and policies were getting made that really shape, how at vulnerable or how at risk or how resilient a given community is. And even though my program was focused on like land use and environmental planning and natural hazards, I think it was just was about exposure to, you know, not only incredible classmates who are coming from a really diverse background, definitely not all, you know, policy or government oriented, just a real range of folks who came to, you know, address issues they were seeing in their communities or more broadly, different ideas and ways of thinking. So there was a class about like systems thinking, and I think everyone could probably agree that, you know, there's such urgency with a lot of the challenges that we have that we can't really afford to be, you know, investing in very siloed sort of one track minded ways. We have to be looking across the systems and trying to find those co-benefits and you know, get the biggest bang for your buck, so to say. But I would also just point to, you know, planning school is one of those like relatively safe spaces and training grounds where, you know, you get to practice working in teams, interdisciplinary collaboration. I took a really helpful class on both facilitation and conflict resolution. So that role playing of, you know, there's the traditional like environment and developer conflict, but then there's these other, you know, maybe more wicked problems of how do you balance all these different stakeholder interests while trying to meet multiple objectives and deal with, you know, the politics, which is sort of inherent in planning. And then think about, you know, opportunities for transformational work, whether it's in the wake of a major disaster or other sort of shock to the system. So I would say that. And then second, which was really important, was just gaining that foundation and expanded awareness about historic injustices that were perpetuated by planning as a profession and government agencies in particular. So to not only avoid those mistakes in the past or you know, perpetuating that harm, but to focus the energy and resources in those communities that have been disproportionately affected and help rectify or heal, and then, you know, do truly authentic community engagement and trust building that you know, allows for real progress to be made in the places where it's needed most. So there was that, and I think I was fortunate to have opportunities to work on real world issues. After Hurricane Matthew in North Carolina in 2016, there were groups of graduate students and faculty and other staff that were assisting some of the smaller, more rural cities of Eastern North Carolina that had experienced major flooding events, and kind of navigating that post-disaster environment where there's a flood of resources and potential investment, and learning how to, you know, understand the historic and emergent needs of communities that are going through that process and how to take it, you know, make the most of that opportunity. So really beneficial overall. And yeah, there's, you know, there's a lot of sort of technical things that I don't use that much anymore because I'm situated in a kind of a unique office of resilience that doesn't do necessarily the capital P planning, but we do work super closely with our planning department at the county, and I can speak that language as well as, you know, translate across our other departments and disciplines who may not be as familiar with climate change, future conditions, you know, real equity concerns. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Christian, for the helpful perspective. Kai, do you want to hear next?
Yeah. How did planning school prepare? So just going off of what Christian said, I think there were a lot of things that helped me prepare for this. But I think the interdisciplinary perspective that planning provides is pretty good, especially in my position where there are a lot of silos. Whoever is thinking about working in local governments or county governments or state governments, you know, it's decades and decades of siloing that is happening. And so breaking down those silos takes a lot of patience and a lot of communication skills, and some perseverance. And I mean, planning in itself is interdisciplinary, so you're gonna have that perspective no matter what. But some of the departments that you're working with are much more narrowly focused, like engineering and things like that. So, just being aware that they have an objective that's very focused, while yours is much broader with longer time horizons. But yeah, I mean, I think communication again is just a really big one. Communicating with the public, translating kind of the jargony planning speak that we use a lot internally, and making sure that you're translating well and communicating well to the general public so that they don't feel isolated or removed from the communities that they live in. And yeah, I mean, there's also the hard skills, which I think are really important to have, even if you don't use them later on, as you kind of move up in your career. But you don't, in my opinion, you don't want to lose perspective on those things. So like crunching numbers in Excel, using GIS, being able to write a memo, all those things are like super important, even if you're not the ones that are doing it day to day. I went to a school that was specifically, I chose Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo because there is a climate focus. There's a climate action planning class, there's a climate adaptation class. And yeah, to anyone who's in school, to the degree that you can get some real world experience, working on a project, whether it's through an internship or a class, so that when you come out of planning school, you've already got like a project or two under your belt and you get that real world experience. And I guess the last would be like public speaking. You're put in a hot seat a lot, especially in local governments. And so feeling comfortable answering questions, and improvising a little bit at times, which is a hard skill to create, but really important to have, because you're not going to have the answer to everything all the time.
Great point. Oh, thanks. Annie?
Yeah, I feel like I'm batting cleanup on this one because I think that Kai and Christian covered a lot of it. I chose the planning route because I think Kai mentioned it. The interdisciplinary nature of it was very attractive to me. It feels like these problems are so intersectional, but then when it gets to solving them, it's so siloed. And I think planning is one of those programs and like fields that really does kind of stretch the, it touches transportation and housing and land use and climate. And so I think that more of us need to be thinking like holistically like that. And planning school definitely, depending on the program, it gives you that opportunity to kind of dip your toes into a lot of different, regulatory and policy spaces, and also project management spaces. I'm one of the panelists here. I'm not working in city government. I'm working as an outside agitator and an advocate, but work with city government all the time. And my degree has been instrumental in helping understand how things move on the other side, what the barriers are, and where our advocacy is most effective in helping push to move past certain barriers. And so it is really helpful to be able to speak the language that, our government is talking internally speaking, or, the way that they're thinking about approaching projects, or the way that they need to, and understanding that bureaucracy, which is especially, at Hunter College, which is very focused on New York City and the structures that exist here, has been incredibly helpful, like so many classes that just directly overlap with the work that I'm doing, and able to kind of pull some of the teachings, some of the stories or insights that professors have, many of which who have like worked for the city or have worked alongside the city for many years. And so, yeah, I think it's a degree that really requires like problem solving and patience, definitely. And I also think that, I get this question a lot, but a lot of my work is really focused on policy, but planning is something that's much more like tangible and you're building something physical. And I think that the relationship between projects and policy, it becomes very clear when you're working in the space, and it's very useful to have a grasp on both because they implicate each other. They implicate one another. And so I think that it has been incredibly helpful to get to go to school and do like deep dives on some of the policies that then we're seeing play out in real time, or to understand, processes for how the city, comes to a solution or a project that they want to implement, all the planning that goes into that and all of the time, all of the time talking and spent kind of like moving it through certain systems. And so I think it's a really great option if you want to go into public service, you want to work alongside public service, and you want to learn like how the sausage gets made. I think that this is, it's the space where you will get to learn the mechanics of how government works.
Great. Thank you all. Really insightful answers. Okay, moving on to the next question. What are the current opportunities in this line of work that you're aware of? Are you seeing kind of like increased need for climate planners, or just like a need for other sectors of planners to be educated on climate's impact? And yeah, the final question will be, what advice would you give to a student interested in working in the intersection of climate, migration, and housing? So that one can kind of morph into the other one if you're interested in answering both at the same time. Christian, can we start with you?
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, I think feels like there's a growing number of opportunities. I can't say I'm as tapped in, like haven't been on the job market for a couple of years, so I haven't been paying as close attention. But I would say, there's at least in Florida, I know, and I've seen it in other parts of the US too, if that's where folks are interested in working. There's a growing number of resiliency and sustainability sort of offices or arms at the local level, the state level. And often if they don't have their own sort of like housing, arm or section, they collaborate closely with that, that department or that other entity that's focused on housing. And so there's a lot of collaboration to happen there. And there's a lot of, kind of thinking of like planning to implementation. There's a lot of assessments, vulnerability assessments, and other analyses that people are, if they haven't already done it, it's becoming requirements to help guide, investments in the future and prioritize things effectively. A lot of the federal government, work is spending a lot of money that's come after the major Infrastructure Jobs Act and other spending bills. And so there's really along that spectrum of, from the early planning, engagement, assessment to developing prioritized action plans. Of course, there's a lot of grant opportunities, so grant writing and the implementation of those grants. I think data visualization and mapping is, for folks who are either kind of on that GIS or similar track, there's, a map that is well crafted can really influence major decisions. We've seen that happen here in Miami-Dade County. And then of course there's community-based organizations or nonprofits that are really like Annie mentioned, pushing and advocating those in power to do more. And there's some that are focused just on housing, some that are maybe more sort of leaning into climate, and more and more they're doing both, right? Because they see the connections. And so and then I can't speak as much to the academic sort of track, but I am seeing a lot of more like interdisciplinary centers and research labs that are focused on housing innovation, design, and connecting that to climate resilience. So I do see planners as, uniquely positioned and prepared to facilitate those conversations. That's more holistic, as we've been saying, and doing that at different scales as well, which is going to be needed. And then I guess like advice for students interested in working in climate migration and housing. I think it's been kind of mentioned, but tapping into, local community-based organizations and just showing up. Like that's really more than half of it is showing up and being eager and willing to listen and learn and join groups and folks who are maybe already doing the work and bringing your own perspective and skill sets to that. I think there's something to be said about the future of climate migration and housing and how important land use is going to be with that. We mentioned like community land trust being one of those mechanisms that can be, facilitate and organize on what that looks like for a community and what that transition looks like if things are changing in the environment. And then just, let your curiosity drive you to find, individuals or organizations that really align with your values, so that you can, just build on those relationships and maintain them and be adaptable, I guess, since there's a lot that is changing. And then if I can just mention real quick, there's a great documentary that just came out about climate gentrification in Miami called Raising Liberty City. It's actually airing on PBS. I can share the link with you, Katie, afterwards, but I think folks can view it online. Really good insight into issues in Miami and what it looks like to be on both the developer side, who's maybe trying to like bring, updated housing to a community and all the issues that surround that. So I'll end with that.
Yeah, that would be super helpful, Christian. Thank you. Kai, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so opportunities, I think it's a little bit different than it would have been maybe like 5 or 6 years ago getting into climate work, whereas like generally being interested in climate and sustainability would be enough, and it's getting to the point where there's so much work to be done that having a specialty will really help you out. Yeah, as Christian was saying, like it really depends on where you are and what the climate impacts are going to be or what the issues are in where you're thinking you want to work too. It's water, and if you're in the West, it's flooding. If you're in the Northeast, on the adaptation side. So I think about that. Yeah, as Christian mentioned, implementation, we're kind of moving away, in my mind, moving away from the like planning and assessment and analysis phase. We know what the impacts are. We know what work needs to be get done. So now it's more moving into like grants, implementation, funding. So I think that's where things are going to go, as they mentioned, like the federal funding through the Inflation Reduction Act, and others. So I think it would be important to have some like not finance, but some business or accounting, implementation, budgeting, all of that kind of stuff, I think is going to be more and more important in the future. Existing building decarbonization is going to be really, really big, and there's just such a big housing stock to do it in. I think that there's a lot of like room for growth in that space in terms of jobs in the private and public sector. The nice part is that if you have a planning degree, you don't necessarily have to go into like the public sector or the nonprofits, community-based organization sector. There's also like there's a lot of new companies that are doing this work that are actually on the implementation side. So I wouldn't rule that out in terms of like you're working with the government, local governments, obviously, but there's implementation companies that are doing all this work now too. What advice I'm gonna give to students? Yeah, I just pulled up a couple. So ASAP American Society of Adaptation Professionals. That's a good one to just like get plugged into. Urban Sustainability Directors Network. That's one that there's just always job opportunities. They've got career boards and things like that. Yeah, APA, obviously. Yeah, figuring out what's going on in that individual community. And then I wrote down a couple others. Workforce training for the green economy is going to be huge. So if you want to do workforce training, that'll be a thing. Adaptive reuse is like the commercial real estate sector is shifting a lot, and just like the nature of work. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there in terms of housing, prefabricated housing. Yeah, and then just understand the building approval process, the local planning and approval process, because that is kind of like the bread and butter of everything. If you're gonna be using or working in the built environment. So don't overlook that just to focus on climate and the kind of sexier stuff. Having that like baseline knowledge of how buildings get planned and approved is pretty fundamental.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Kai, I think took my one point that I was gonna add to Christian's, which so I'll keep this brief, but I think the building decarbonization space is something that we're seeing really take off, you know, just through government laws and regulations, but especially in the Northeast and in New York in particular, where we have a really dense building stock. In New York City, buildings are 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Decarbonizing multifamily buildings, you know, big buildings is a lot more complicated than single family homes. And from the nonprofit side, a lot of foundations are looking to fund organizations that are working on building decarbonization. And I would challenge folks to like also think about that through an equity perspective, knowing that New York has a really large population of renters. How are we making sure that people who are renting and maybe are also living in buildings that have, you know, have environmental hazards, have been subject to deferred maintenance? How are we making sure that those folks are getting healthy, clean, electrified homes without displacement? It's a hard question that I don't have an answer to, and I'm super interested to talk to anybody who's been thinking about that. But I do think that that is a space that like will be very relevant and important in our, you know, for the rest of my life. So definitely, I would say a consideration if you're thinking about specializing, and very much so also at this intersection of climate and housing. The other, like, I'll just mention that I see a lot on top of like the federal funding that's coming down for some of these bigger infrastructure and resiliency projects. New York State passed the Bond Act last year, 2 years ago. That's going to release a lot of money to, you know, upkeep water infrastructure, you know, improve access to waterfront, to do a series of resiliency projects and electrification projects. And so, you know, I think that's another area that we're seeing, at least in New York, like, you know, a recommitment to revitalizing our waterfronts and our greenways. And then last, also like, you know, renewable energy. I mean, that is like a very complicated sector, but does have, you know, some planning elements, especially when you're thinking about like building transmission lines, and very complicated, but also going to be like a very big field and very important. And, you know, right now in New York State, there's multiple massive multi-year projects that are trying to get off the ground that are going to bring more renewable energy to our grid. And, you know, we're going to require a lot of people working on that. So there's some thoughts that I have.
Great, thanks. And oh, and going off with being, since you're a current full-time employee of the organization and a graduate student, do you have any advice in that space about navigating planning school while also working?
I'm so sorry, Katie, can you repeat that one time?
Yeah,
Sounded
no problem. Do you have any advice, like in particular, because you are a full-time employee of the organization and also a planning graduate student at the same time, like navigating graduate school while also working in this space, like maybe what advice you would give to students that are like looking to work while also pursuing graduate study?
Got it. Be cognizant of your sanity. But I think also just like figuring out where the ideally you're working in a space that overlaps with the degree that you're getting. And I've been able, which is like the most rewarding thing, been able to take projects that I have to do for work and use them for projects that I have to do for school. And that gives me, you know, it carves out dedicated time to dive deeper into an issue or, you know, a planning project or a program or something that I had to do for work anyway. I get to do a much more thorough job because I'm also doing it as like a project. And so trying to figure out, you know, where you can kind of, I don't want to call it double dipping, but really where you can like help yourself and like use your degree to help your work and vice versa has been, I think personally for me, very optimal. And also cool because I get to like, you know, come back to my team at work and like can share from more of an expertise type of viewpoint than I might have been able to if I was just assigned that project to work on without the background education that I'm, you know, simultaneously getting. But yeah, it's a lot. So definitely I think have like some coping skills of ways that you can relax also because you know, you need to carve out a little bit of time for yourself so you don't burn out. But um I think Kai mentioned it, or maybe Christian, but like internships are also awesome. If you can afford to do that, or you can figure out a situation where you can be working an internship because it gives you, I think, insights into different spaces to see if they're a good fit for you. Not everybody's going to like the community nonprofit space. Not everybody's going to like the local government space. Not everyone's going to like the private sector space. And so the more that you can kind of like see how these different dynamics play out in real life, I think is really helpful for figuring out the direction that you want to go post degree.
Great, thank you so much, Anne. Thank you guys. This was all really insightful and helpful information. We have just about 12 minutes left in our slotted time for the call. So if anybody from the audience has a question, I would love if you would either drop it in the chat or raise your hand and I'll unmute you. But yeah, we can take questions from the audience now. Anybody has? No pressure, but thanks, Dylan. Okay, well, if nobody has any questions, I really appreciate everyone's time. Thanks especially to our panelists. I'll be sending out a post-event survey that has the recording if anybody wants to go back and get some information. Christian, if you want to send over that documentary resource, I'd be happy to share that in the post-event email as well. We have another upcoming panel in this climate career panel series on March 14th, which is on decarbonization. Oh, we do have a question from Will. With the lead pipe and paint action plan put forth by Biden, been involved with the planning department in battling lead pipes in your respective communities or in your counties? Does anybody want to answer that?
I can answer that one a little bit.
Yeah.
So yeah, because last week we just we applied for a grant that the New York State put out called Leading in Lead Prevention Pilot Program, which was I think 20 or 50 million that the governor put forward for lead remediation in apartments and low income apartments. And so we won that grant, which is nice. We're kicking that off. It's going to be a little complicated. You're working with landlords who are, you know, required to do this remediation, but oftentimes do not have the capital to do it. You're also remediating apartments with folks who are already at risk of lead exposure. And so a lot of these projects are going to require relocation for a number of months to get them out of the apartments while they're doing the remediation. So yeah, it's going to be a little bit of a complex issue, but excited to do it. We've got this one zip code in our community that is at much higher risk. They do lead testing in schools, and that's how they kind of identify where there are households with higher lead exposure levels. Yeah, it is, as Annie mentioned, it's kind of this overlooked issue that has been around for a while, but because it's so complex and sticky, I don't think a lot of attention has been paid to it. It's really nice that that the governor is putting money towards it. We don't have the lead pipe issue as much, but we do have a sister city to the south of us, Poughkeepsie, that does have a lot of those issues too. So I'm interested to see what they do with that.
Great, thank you, Kai. Really helpful perspective. Any other questions from the audience? Thanks, Will, for having your contrast. Question from Dylan. Is the biggest conflict in providing climate solutions and integrating environmental sustainability within housing simply budgetary, or is it a matter of staffing, or are there is there anything else that makes it hard?
I can try. Yeah, it is a big question. And I don't work in city government, but I pay a lot of attention to local municipal government. So I can give it a shot, but I think Christian or Kai might be better at answering. And I think that I mentioned it, like we're overcoming decades of siloing, and sustainability for a long time was like not a thing that city governments really thought about. And so that's also like a newer kind of issue area. I think that there is not a lot of crosstalk between agencies from what I see. But staffing is an issue like across the board. At least I can say in New York City. A lot of our agencies that are responsible with implementing, many of these very ambitious laws that we've passed do not have the staff to do so. And so that really puts into question, the integrity of what those laws are attempting to do, and if they can actually accomplish, the goals that they were set out to or the problems they were set out to solve. I think that there is slowly some integration that's happening. New York City's Housing and Preservation Development Agency is getting a lot more involved in sustainability, and they have like a sustainability team there. But I think it is overcoming deep bureaucratic silos, and putting money towards things that have not historically received money also feels incredibly difficult because budgets are designed so that multi issues are like fighting against one another for resources. There are definitely ways to expand that pot of money that the government has available to them, but a lot of our elected officials don't feel like doing those actions. And so what happens is that education is fighting healthcare, is fighting housing, is fighting climate, and that's not a good position to be in. And so the more overlap that we can come up with budget asks and agency asks is really helpful, but it can get pretty difficult when like one agency can do one thing and one agency can do another, but they can't work together. And we see that unfortunately quite a bit in some of our work.
Great, Annie, that was a really helpful perspective.
I can just add on to that really quickly.
Yeah.
I think the other piece that we're seeing at least is it's the workforce itself. There's the workforce age is shrinking in the country already, and so in the next couple of decades that's going to be the case. But specifically contractors and construction trades, the average age is increasing. So there's not a lot of folks who are moving into that space. So I think there's a huge, if it can be done equitably and right, there's a huge opportunity to like train another generation of maybe not planners, but I often think I should just be going and doing the contracting myself rather than planning and finding budgets for it. But yeah, so that's a big barrier too. You can have all the money in the world to decarbonize your building sector, but if you don't have a workforce to actually do the work, it doesn't really matter. So
Yeah, and I'll just echo well, all of what was just said and what Annie was pointing to about there's sort of like an institutional inertia to do things the way they've always been done. And um that could be both internal to like a city or county government, or for the development or private sector community who is more often than not going to follow the minimum requirements for building code and other things. And so unless there are some really strong incentive programs or updates to design manuals and procedures that could be decades old, a lot of things are getting, maybe designed or built in a way that isn't as resilient or sustainable. And then there's definitely like, yeah, I'll just end at that.
Great, thank you all. Those really helpful perspective. Great question, Dylan. Thank you for asking. So thanks again to all of our speakers. I'll be sending out the post-event survey if all of you would not mind taking a few minutes to answer and what you got out of this experience and maybe give us some advice for future climate career panels that you would like to see, or even any ACSP career series that you would like to see, because we're in close contact with their staff as well. Thanks again, everyone, and feel free to email me at the same email address that you got this Zoom link from if you have any questions. Be sure to attend our decarbonization and transportation panel 3 weeks from today on March 14th from 3 to 4 Eastern Standard Time. And if you've already registered for that, I'll be sending out a link in the next couple of weeks. And then we have one more this spring on April 23rd, which is going to be a Tuesday from 3 to 4 p.m. That final topic is climate planning and local government, which will include some other great individuals working in local government on kind of more broad climate planning issues that extend beyond housing, and we'll draw some of the great perspectives that Kai and Christian and Annie raised today. Thanks again, everyone, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or concerns. Have a great afternoon.
thank you.
Take care.